Hello, I'm Doug Wentz, and welcome to Make Moderates Matter. In my last video, episode 2, which I encourage you to watch if you haven't already, I provided more details about my political background. I noted, among other things, that I started life as a Republican, but now I'm a registered independent, and that the goal of this channel is to empower moderation in American politics. I plan to review what it means to be a political moderate, and how we can make moderates matter, whether through political parties and organizations, or by changing the structure and mechanics of the voting process. I also noted, however, that in September of 2024, shortly before the presidential election, I delivered a speech on the front steps of the Pennsylvania State Capitol building in Harrisburg entitled, "Donald Trump's January 6th Insurrection and Endless Corruption. Why Don't You Care?" I now would like to present a brief overview of my speech for the record. This video will summarize the first half of my speech, which focused on the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And my next video, episode 4, will cover the second half of my speech with a Donald Trump corruption timeline. And finally, after that, in episode 5, I will move on to consider why, despite everything I covered in my speech, some moderates nevertheless may have voted for Trump, and how, regardless, we can all work together to make moderates matter in American politics. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The first half of my speech on the steps of the Pennsylvania Capitol before the 2024 election focused on the events of January 6. I began by reading significant portions of the final report of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol that was published in December of 2022, which I'll refer to hereafter as simply the report. The report was a bipartisan effort. The Select Committee included not only Democrats but also Republicans Liz Cheney of Wyoming, who served as co-chair, and Adam Kinzinger of Illinois. In addition, the vast majority of the several dozen witnesses who testified before the committee were all Republicans. This is an important point that can't be understated. Donald Trump likes to accuse anyone who criticizes him of being a radical socialist Democrat, but the truth is that not only the vast majority of people who testified before the committee, but also nearly all the people I quoted throughout my speech were Republicans. Chapter 1 of the report is entitled "The Big Lie." It notes that while Donald Trump claimed that the 2020 election was stolen, that was false. The report notes as follows. As longtime Republican election attorney Benjamin Ginsburg testified before the Select Committee, the president's camp did have their day in court. It's just that in no instance did a court find that the charges of fraud were real. In total, the Trump campaign and allies of President Trump filed 62 separate lawsuits between November 4 of 2020 and January 6 of 2021, calling into question or seeking to overturn the election results. Out of 62 cases, only one resulted in a victory for the president or his allies, which affected relatively few votes, did not vindicate any underlying claims of fraud, and would not have changed the outcome in Pennsylvania. Report at page 210. Chapter 2 of the report is entitled, "I Just Want to Find 11,780 Votes." The report notes that, in a now infamous telephone call on January 2, 2021, President Trump pressured Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger for more than an hour. The president confronted him with multiple conspiracy theories about the election, none of which were true. Raffensperger and other Georgia officials debunked these allegations one after another during their call. And then the president made his demand. So look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, President Trump told Raffensperger. It was a stunning moment. The President of the United States was asking a state's chief election officer to quote-unquote find enough votes to declare him the winner of an election he lost. Raffensperger saw the president's warning to him on January 2nd as a threat. I felt then, and I still believe today, that this was a threat, Raffensperger wrote in his book, Report at page 263. Chapter 3 of the report covers the fake electors plot. It describes how President Trump and his allies prepared their own fake slates of electoral college electors in 7 states that President Trump lost. Chapter 4 of the report is entitled, Just Call It Corrupt and Leave the Rest to Me. It was a particularly painful chapter for me to read because, unfortunately, it includes quite a few references to Scott Perry, the Republican congressman from the 10th Congressional District in Pennsylvania that includes my former home in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. The report notes, on the evening of December 27th, Representative Perry emailed Acting Attorney General Donahue a set of documents alleging significant voting fraud had occurred in Pennsylvania. One document asserted that election authorities had counted 205,000 more votes than had been cast. Representative Perry also shared this same claim on Twitter the following day. President Trump kept raising the same claim, but it was not true. Acting Deputy Attorney General Donahue forwarded Representative Perry's email to Scott Brady, who was the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania at the time. As Brady soon discovered, there was no discrepancy. President Trump's supporters came up with the claim by comparing the Pennsylvania Secretary of State's website, which reported the total number of votes as 5.25 million, to a separate state election registry, which showed only 5 million votes cast. The problem was simple. Pennsylvania's election site had not yet been updated. The totals for 4 counties had not yet been reported on the election site. Once those votes were counted on the site, the totals matched. This was simply not an example of fraud as President Trump, Representative Perry, and others would have it. Report at page 389. The chapter notes that Trump nevertheless continued to pepper Attorney General William Barr with unsupported conspiracy theories about the election. The big ones that Barr investigated, including claims that Dominion voting machines switched votes and that votes had been dumped at the end of the night in Milwaukee and Detroit. Barr assured President Trump that the allegations were untrue and were not supported by the evidence. But that didn't stop President Trump from repeatedly citing these fictional accounts. Eventually, then, Barr had enough, and he resigned. As Barr testified before the committee, I made clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff which I told the president was bullshit. And you know, I didn't want to be part of it. Trump appointed Attorney General Bill Barr. Report at page 379. And pardon my French, but that was a direct quote. The chapter also details meetings between Trump and the new acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen as follows. Trump referenced 3 Republican politicians, all of whom had supported the president's election lies and the Stop the Steal campaign. One was Representative Scott Perry. President Trump also referenced Representative Jim Jordan from Ohio, praising him as a fighter. Representatives Perry and Jordan had often teamed up to spread lies about the election. The two spoke at a Stop the Steal rally in front of the Pennsylvania State Capitol in Harrisburg, just days after the November election. Report at pages 384 and 385. In other words, Republican Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio and Scott Perry of Pennsylvania held one of the very first Stop the Steal rallies at the very spot on the Capitol steps in Harrisburg where I was standing to deliver my speech. And when I pause to think about that, I honestly don't know whether to laugh or cry. Chapter 5 of the report is entitled, A Coup in Search of a Legal Theory. The report notes that President Trump summoned Vice President Pence to a meeting in the Oval Office where he pressured Pence to reject the certified electors from several states or delay the joint session of Congress. The report notes that Pence repeatedly rejected Trump's demands and correctly pointed out that he had no power to take any action other than counting the certified electoral votes. Report at page 428. Chapter 6 of the report is entitled, Be There, We'll Be Wild. It begins as follows. On December 14, 2020, electors around the country met to cast their electoral college votes. The people and the states had spoken. Members of the President Trump's own cabinet knew the election was over. Attorney General William Barr viewed it as the end of the matter. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Secretary of Labor Eugene Scalia concurred. That same day, Scalia told President Trump directly that he should concede defeat. President Trump had no intention of conceding. As he plotted ways to stay in power, the president summoned a mob for help. At 1:42 a.m. on December 19th, President Trump tweeted, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there. Will be wild." Report at page 499. Chapter 7 of the report is entitled 187 Minutes of Dereliction. In my mind, it is the most chilling chapter of the report. It notes that as the whole world watched the attack on the Capitol unfold live on television, Donald Trump didn't tell his rioters to disperse for over 3 hours. It was a disgraceful dereliction of duty and an assault on the very foundation of American democracy. The report notes that at 1:10 p.m. on January 6th, President Trump concluded his speech at the Ellipse. By that time, the attack on the U.S. Capitol had already begun, but it was about to get much worse. The president told thousands of people in attendance to march down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol. He told them to fight like hell, because if they didn't, they were not going to have a country anymore. By 1:21 p.m., President Trump was informed that the Capitol was under attack. He could have interceded immediately, but the president chose not to do so. It was not until 4:17 p.m. that President Trump finally tweeted a video in which he told the rioters to go home. The 187 minutes between the end of President Trump's speech and when he finally told the mob to leave the U.S. Capitol was a dereliction of duty. President Trump could have called top officials to ensure that they quelled the violence. He made no such calls. Instead, President Trump reached out to Rudolph Giuliani and friendly members of Congress, seeking their assistance in delaying the joint session of Congress. And the president tweeted at 2:24 p.m. at the height of the violence that his own vice president lacked the courage to act, a statement that could only enrage the mob further. Report at page 577. Finally, at 4:17 p.m., Trump issued his video telling the rioters to disperse. But as the report notes, even then, President Trump did not disavow the rioters. He endorsed their cause, openly sympathized with them, and repeated his big lie once again. "I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us," President Trump said at the beginning of his 4:17 p.m. video. "It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order. We don't want anybody hurt. This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special," President Trump said. Report at pages 579 to 580. Chapter 8 of the report provides an analysis of the attack on the Capitol. It notes, among other things, that more than 140 Capitol and Metropolitan Police were injured, some very seriously. A perimeter line of Metropolitan Police intended to secure the Capitol against intrusion broke in the face of thousands of armed rioters, more than 2,000 of whom gained access to the interior of the Capitol building. A woman who attempted to forcibly enter the chamber of the House of Representatives through a broken window while the House was in session was shot and killed by police guarding the chamber. Vice President Pence and his family were at risk, as were those Secret Service professionals protecting him. 5 police officers who were at the Capitol on January 6 died in the days following the riot. Report at pages 76 and 711. And finally, the conclusion of the report provides recommendations. It emphasizes the need for accountability and notes that the Select Committee made criminal referrals to the Department of Justice and other authorities so they could determine whether to prosecute the individuals involved in the attack on the Capitol, including President Trump. Following the attack on the Capitol, attempts to hold Donald Trump accountable for the day's events began almost immediately. Congress convened that same night to certify the election results, and as reported by C-SPAN, Republican Senator Mitt Romney of Utah said the following: "Today was heartbreaking, and I was shaken to the core as I thought about the people I'd met in China and Russia and other places who yearn for freedom and to look to this building and these shores as a place of hope. And I saw the images being broadcast around the world, and it breaks my heart. Now we gather due to a selfish man's injured pride and the outrage of his supporters whom he has deliberately misinformed for the past 2 months and stirred to action this very morning. What happened here today was an insurrection, incited by the President of the United States, Republican Senator Mitt Romney." Soon thereafter, as reported by the Wall Street Journal, at least 8 Trump administration officials resigned in protest, including 2 cabinet secretaries, Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao and Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. Donald Trump then was impeached for his role in the attack on the Capitol 1 week before his term expired. As reported by the New York Times and PBS News, it was the 4th impeachment of a U.S. president and the 2nd for Trump after his first impeachment in the Ukraine investigation in December of 2019. The House of Representatives adopted 1 article of impeachment against Trump for incitement of insurrection, and Trump became the first president to be impeached twice. As reported by NBC News, the Senate acquitted Trump of the charges, with 43 senators, all Republican, voting not guilty. Nevertheless, 7 Republican senators joined the entire Democratic caucus in voting for conviction, which was the most bipartisan presidential impeachment vote in the Senate to date. The 7 Republican senators who voted to convict Trump were Richard Burr of North Carolina, Susan Collins of Maine, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Mitt Romney of Utah, Ben Sasse of Nebraska, and Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. Significantly, too, while Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell voted to acquit Trump on the technicality that he was no longer in office, McConnell nevertheless made clear that in his view, Trump was responsible for the attack on the Capitol. As reported by C-SPAN, McConnell said the following during his remarks on the Senate floor: "January 6th was a disgrace. American citizens attacked their own government. They used terrorism to try to stop a specific piece of democratic business they did not like. Fellow Americans beat and bloodied our own police. They stormed the Senate floor. They tried to hunt down the Speaker of the House. They built a gallows and chanted about murdering the Vice President. They did this because they had been fed wild falsehoods by the most powerful man on earth, because he was angry he lost an election. Former President Trump's actions preceding the riot were a disgraceful dereliction of duty." McConnell then added the following: "There is no question that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of that day. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president, and their having that belief was a foreseeable consequence of the growing crescendo of false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole which the defeated president kept shouting into the largest megaphone on planet Earth." And finally, as regards Trump's failure to promptly take action to stop the violence once it started, McConnell added the following: "The unconscionable behavior did not end when the violence began. Whatever our ex-president claims he thought might happen that day, whatever reaction he says he meant to produce, by that afternoon he was watching the same live television as the rest of the world. A mob was assaulting the Capitol in his name. These criminals were carrying his banners, hanging his flags, and screaming their loyalty to him. It was obvious that only President Trump could end this. Former aides publicly begged him to do so. Loyal allies frantically called the administration. But the president did not act swiftly. He did not do his job. He didn't take steps so federal law could be faithfully executed and order restored. Instead, according to public reports, he watched television happily as the chaos unfolded and kept pressing his scheme to overturn the election. Even after it was clear to any reasonable observer that Vice President Pence was in danger, even as the mob carrying Trump banners was beating cops and breaching perimeters, the president sent a further tweet attacking his vice president. Predictably and foreseeably under the circumstances, members of the mob seemed to interpret this as further inspiration to lawlessness and violence. Later, even when the president did half-heartedly begin calling for peace, he did not call right away for the riot to end. He did not tell the mob to depart until even later. And even then, with police officers bleeding and broken glass covering Capitol floors, he kept repeating election lies and praising the criminals. I have made my view of this episode very plain. Republican Senator Mitch McConnell. After Trump's acquittal in the Senate, as reported by CNN and the AP, more than 1,200 Americans were charged criminally as a result of their participation in the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and more than 890 were found guilty of federal crimes. The charges ranged from misdemeanor offenses like trespassing to felonies like assaulting police officers. In addition, as reported by CNN and the HuffPost, 6 people were convicted of seditious conspiracy. 4 members of the Proud Boys group were sentenced to prison terms, and 2 members of the Oath Keepers were sentenced to terms ranging from 12 to 18 years. But despite all this, as reported by the New York Times, The Hill, and the Des Moines Register, Donald Trump repeatedly said that he would pardon the rioters, referred to them as hostages, and characterized the January 6th attack as peaceful. And finally, Trump kicked off the first rally of his 2024 presidential campaign by playing a song, Justice for All, that was recorded by the J6 prison choir, which consisted of inmates at a D.C. jail who were serving time for their role in the January 6th attack. The Washington Post later identified 5 of the roughly 15 men who were featured in a video of the song. The Post found that 4 of the men in the video of the J6 prison choir were charged with assaulting police with weapons such as a crowbar, sticks, and chemical spray, including against Officer Brian Sicknick, who died the next day. But not everyone was singing Trump's song, and even some of the convicted rioters lay responsibility for the violence squarely at Trump's feet. As reported by CNN and NPR, one such Jan 6 rioter was Pam Hemphill, a 70-year-old from Boise, Idaho, who was sentenced to 60 days in jail. She described the Republican attempts to recharacterize the events of January 6 as peaceful as a gaslighting smear campaign, noting that she was in the midst of the violence and that a police officer saved her life after someone stepped on her head. She added that the election was not stolen and that she held Trump totally responsible for the riot. Eventually, as reported by Politico, a case was filed in Colorado alleging that Donald Trump was ineligible to run for president because of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which states that those who take an oath to defend the Constitution and then engage in an insurrection or rebellion against the same, or give aid and comfort to the enemies thereof, are ineligible to serve. A Colorado judge ruled that Trump did indeed engage in an insurrection, but found that it was unclear whether the presidency was one of the offices to which the amendment applied. As reported by the AP, however, the Colorado Supreme Court later reversed this decision and found that Trump was indeed ineligible for the White House under the Insurrection Clause. In Maine, the Secretary of State made a similar finding, barring Trump from the ballot because he had engaged in insurrection. Trump appealed, however, and as reported by NPR, eventually the U.S. Supreme Court restored him to the ballot in both Colorado and Maine. Significantly, however, the Supreme Court sidestepped the question of whether Trump had engaged in insurrection. Instead, the Supreme Court ruled that the states lacked authority to disqualify Trump, and that only Congress could enforce the Insurrection Clause. Finally, in November of 2022, as reported by the AP, Attorney General Merrick Garland appointed Jack Smith to lead a special counsel investigation of the attempts to overturn the 2020 election. In August of 2023, a grand jury in D.C. indicted Trump on 4 charges for his conduct involving the January 6 Capitol attack, including conspiracy to defraud the United States and conspiring to obstruct an official proceeding. The criminal charge with the longest sentence carried a maximum of 20 years in prison. The indictment also mentioned 6 unnamed co-conspirators. This was the first indictment against a U.S. president concerning actions while in office. Trump pleaded not guilty. Eventually, as reported by CBS News, after various appeals, the conservative majority of the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the long-held view that no man is above the law. Instead, the court ruled in July of 2024 that former presidents have some immunity for criminal prosecution for their quote-unquote official acts made during their presidency, and remanded the DOJ's case to the lower courts for further proceedings to determine which of Trump's misdeeds could be considered official acts. In her dissent, as reported by the AP, Justice Sonia Sotomayor argued that a president should not be a king above the law, and called the decision utterly indefensible and upsetting the status quo that has existed since the founding. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court's action effectively ended the prospect of Trump being put on trial before the November election, which in my mind was one of the greatest injustices in American history. As reported by the AP, Trump also was indicted in Georgia in August of 2023, along with 18 other defendants, for attempting to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election in Georgia. The investigation was led by Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis and focused on Trump's efforts to pressure state officials to change the election outcome. As reported by NBC News, Trump pleaded not guilty in the Georgia case. As reported by ABC News, however, 4 of the defendants in the Georgia case pleaded guilty to various charges. One such defendant was Trump attorney Jenna Ellis, who read a tearful apology in court, saying, among other things, that in hindsight, she would have declined to represent Donald Trump in his post-election challenges and looked back on the situation with deep remorse. Throughout this time, Donald Trump never presented evidence of voter fraud that could have changed the outcome of the election in Georgia or any other state, but as reported by the AP, continued to label the various indictments against him as politically motivated witch hunts. Prominent Republicans, however, disagreed. As reported by Politico, after Trump's indictment in the January 6 case, Vice President Mike Pence said that anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. Former New Jersey Republican Governor Chris Christie posted on X that the events around the White House from election night forward were a stain on our country's history, and that Donald Trump violated his oath to uphold the Constitution and brought shame to his presidency. And as reported by The Hill, upon Trump's indictment in the Georgia case, former Arkansas Republican Governor Asa Hutchinson said that Trump had disqualified himself from ever holding the presidency again. And finally, incredibly, shortly before my speech, Trump appeared to finally have admitted that he actually did in fact lose the 2020 election. As reported by NBC News, just 3 weeks before my speech, Trump acknowledged that he lost the 2020 election, quote-unquote, by a whisker, apparently changing his story in an attempt to appeal to moderate voters in key swing states. This in turn, of course, angered Trump's supporters, including in particular white nationalist Nick Fuentes, who disavowed Trump. As reported by USA Today, Fuentes noted on his podcast that if Trump lost by a whisker, then that vindicated the DOJ charge against him, because if he knew he lost, then he lied to defraud the people. This in turn led Fuentes to ask rhetorically, so why did we do Stop the Steal? Why did anyone go to January 6? Why is anyone sitting in jail? Wow, some really excellent questions there, and from an unlikely source. But of course, faced with this backlash, Trump soon reversed course. As reported by PBS News, during the debate with Kamala Harris, Trump was directly asked about his recent admission on multiple occasions that he lost by a whisker, whereupon he now replied that he was being sarcastic, which presumably was news to Nick Fuentes, who apparently, like the rest of us, had not detected the sarcasm in Trump's voice. So that concludes a brief summary of the first part of my speech on the Capitol steps in Harrisburg, which focused on Donald Trump's role in inciting the January 6 attack on the U.S. Capitol. In my next video, episode 4, I will present the second half of my speech, which focused on my Donald Trump corruption timeline. Episode 4 also will include a postscript update on the developments that have occurred after my speech and the cases pending against Trump. In particular, in November of 2024, as reported by CNN, Special Counsel Jack Smith dropped the election interference case mentioned earlier in this video because the Department of Justice believed that the Constitution prohibits the continued prosecution of a president who is about to take office. And in the Georgia election interference case, in October of 2025, as reported by ABC News, a judge ruled that a new prosecutor must be named by November 14 to replace District Attorney Fani Willis, or the case against all remaining defendants may be dismissed. And regardless, it seems unlikely that Trump could now be prosecuted since he's the sitting president. And finally, in episode 5, after presenting the second half of my speech in episode 4, with my Donald Trump corruption timeline, I will move on to consider why, despite everything I covered in my speech, many moderates must have voted for Trump or he would not have been elected, and how we all can nevertheless work together to make moderates matter, whether or not we voted for Donald Trump. Thanks for watching.